Good afternoon to our panelists and to all of those who are participating wherever you are. It's a beautiful day here on the east coast of Canada, and I am delighted to be joined by three friends and colleagues and individuals who I think have a tremendous history in this country and a great deal to really reflect on in terms of their own careers. I'm going to start quickly with an introduction of the Honourable Leona Aglukkaq, who is was, as mentioned, a former member of Parliament and minister. She has deep roots in the Arctic, and correct me if I'm wrong, Leona, born in Johaven in Nunavut, but currently living in Cape Breton with her husband Robbie and her son Cooper, but still deep ties to the north, and was Canada, notable for today's discussion, was Canada's Minister on the Arctic Council in 2012, but she was also a Minister of Environment and a Minister of Health. So a lot of really hands-on knowledge, not only in terms of the Arctic, but in terms of the environment and climate change. She continues to be active on a number of volunteer and board opportunities that have ties in the Arctic as well. And Leona, thank you so much for joining us. Major General David Fraser, a 32-year veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, served in every rank, a commander from lieutenant to major general in his 32 years. He led operations for Canada in multinational troops. In fact, it's noted in his bio that he is the first Canadian to command American troops since the Second World War, and has written a remarkable book, which I was honored to get a copy of, about Operation Medusa, a ferocious battle that took place in Afghanistan. And General Fraser served there with distinction, as he has, and was recognized by the United States, by NATO, the Netherlands, Poland, the Atlantic Council, and of course by his own country for his remarkable service. Sean Kelly, also a retired member of the Canadian Forces, was a Navy Chief Petty Officer, and also has extensive experience around the globe. Now is the Vice President of Business Development for underwater acoustics manufacturer Geospectrum Technologies. And Sean has also extensive experience on the international scene, is a subject matter expert in terms of underwater operations, warfare, submarine intelligence, and sonar systems, much of which is applicable in terms of the challenges and the opportunities that exist in the Canadian Arctic. So thank you all for joining us today. And I'm going to jump right into this, what I think will be a fascinating discussion. And I do encourage people to send in their questions, which we'll try to pose to our experts. But Leona, let me start with you. You obviously spent a great deal of your life, continue to spend time in the Arctic. We know that climate change is real. We know that the impacts are intense and apparent. What would you say with respect to the obligations that we have as a country to do more in the Arctic and to respond more appropriately to the changes that are happening in that sensitive and important part of our country?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for having me today. Nice to meet everyone. In terms of what's happening in the Arctic related to climate change, I think the number one issue that I see is the current system, that's lack of engagement with Arctic people in coming up with solutions to address the changing environment that we're facing in the north. The other piece is that there's increased traffic through the north in the summers. There's cruise ships coming through, and where the lack of preparedness in terms of responding to an emergency is also lacking at the moment, related to the Arctic and changing climate. But those, I think, would be the number one pressing issues, is that our inability to respond to any emergency crisis as it relates to cruise ships, as an example. The traditional knowledge of Indigenous people and the environment that's changing should also be incorporated into understanding what the changes are. There are many Northerners that have lived and worked and in the Arctic that are firsthand knowledge of what changes they are seeing in the environment, whether that be the ice conditions and warming weather. And I think right now we're not tapping into that rich resources of information from the local hunters, as an example, in identifying what changes that are being seen currently in the north. So I think about, I mean, I point out those 3 points as emerging issues, but at the same time, I think there are also opportunities to working to tapping into the resources of information from the northern people.
Thank you, Leona. David, next to you, Leona has mentioned, the opening of Arctic waters and the changing climate there, which creates a new environment. Now, many people talk about the security environment and think only in terms of military. And if you would reflect on things such as the Arctic operations that take there, sometimes known as Op Nanook, but how the Canadian government and the Canadian forces can respond to those challenges.
Well, Peter, thank you very much for allowing me to talk to you, everyone, today. I reflect back on 40 plus years of operations in the military and in the private sector, and I see such great change in our north, where when I first joined the military, it was a vast, expansive space that was pretty well not transversable, but all that has changed. And what has really changed is politically, Russia has become an aggressor in a way that, as we watch Ukraine, that we can no longer take for granted that they border our country, that we can, think that they're not going to come in. Two, because of what Leona has said, because of the climate change, it is now accessible by commercial traffic. It's accessible by to the resources that are underneath there. The Russian and the Chinese capability has now changed from slow-moving bombers and missiles to supersonic, hypersonic, and space assets. What was once not accessible is now a significant strategic economic area that we have to protect. And so Operation Nanook and everything that the forces do and what the government does behooves us now to get involved to defend our sovereignty, to demonstrate that we are willing to protect, 40% of Canada's land mass. This is something that we must do an awful lot more, as illustrated, quite frankly, recently by the NORAD renewal. But this is now a strategic priority for Canada.
Terrific. And I want to come back to that recent announcement around NORAD renewal, because I think that is a centerpiece of Arctic security. But Sean, much of that is predicated on new technologies or the modernization, if you will, of the existing system, which is now some have described as obsolete. But that is in your wheelhouse in many ways, because the new system of systems will have to include much more maritime surveillance, and maritime technology, of course, is very much an area of your expertise and your prior career in the Navy. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me here. Right now, as technology is moving forward, communications is the key, and communicating from the Arctic to the south is probably the biggest challenge at this point in time. But one of the issues that is had right now is that we don't really know enough about the Arctic to do persistent monitoring and surveillance in the Arctic to make sure that we understand the environment both above, on, and below the waterways. And I think that we need to tap the resource of the people that are currently living there. And I completely agree with General Fraser with respect to securing the Arctic, and Op Nanook is a great start. But really, we need to be able to learn how to do persistent surveillance in the Arctic and not just carry out 1 or 2 exercises a year. There has to be a significant contribution from the government to allow companies, organizations, and even potential agreements, bilateral and multilateral agreements with the Arctic nations to work together to understand and do surveillance in the Arctic. And that's not just in the security way, that's surveillance of the marine mammals, of the various fish that are up there. And those are all things that companies like my own have been working up there, but we certainly think we could do a lot more.
I want to talk about that role for the private sector, but just before we do, Leona, I'd like to come back to the reference that you and Sean and David have all made with respect to the intimate knowledge, the innate knowledge that the people of the Arctic have. You grew up there. You served in various capacities, including at the municipal and territorial level. Have worked with the private sector as well. Is there to date still enough true participation by the people of the Arctic in the decision making and on the security front? Of course, the Arctic Rangers play a critically important role, often described as Canada's eyes and ears of the North. But it really comes down to, at this point in our history as a country, to decision making and making informed, proper decisions that will first and foremost serve the interests of the people of the North first.
I mean, I would have to say that there's very little engagement from, I'd say, the federal level in engaging Northerners in some of the identifying of issues and challenges, and not even just at the local level, but at the government-to-government relations and the engagement of the territorial government or the Inuit organizations is lacking. When I talk about, tapping into the resources of knowledge that people have, like people work the land up there and have lived in the harshest environment in the world for many years and have intimate knowledge of the environment that they live in. And so there's a wealth of information there that I think the government can do a better job of accessing in coming up with some of the solutions and the challenges that we deal with in the North. But really at this point, I don't see any federal leadership in engaging Northerners in coming up with some of the solutions or solutions to some of the challenges that we're facing in terms of even security, as an example. And we are in the Arctic. We are in the 25 communities in Nunavut. It's a coastal community, and the engagement, I think, has to really significantly improve in coming up with addressing some of the challenges that our government may be dealing with in the North. I mean, we're in the communities and should be part of the solutions at this point.
Leona, I know you served on the Arctic Council significantly, and I recall you quite frankly taking on Sergei Lavrov as your Russian counterpart at the Arctic Council. Now that's currently suspended, and it is a forum for the 8 Arctic nations, 6 indigenous communities, and these so-called near Arctic nations. And I'd like to come back to that in a moment. But tell me a little bit about your experience on the Arctic Council and whether that is a useful forum for the dialogue and discussion around cooperation in the North. Because, with a smaller population relative to the rest of the country, just I think 113,000, if I'm not mistaken, across the territories, similar small populations in other countries, it seems we need a force multiplier in the Arctic when it comes to having their voice heard.
Mm-hmm. I think the Arctic Council is an excellent forum to engage other Arctic countries in coming up with some of the solutions. During our chairmanship, one of the goals that I had during that time was the overarching theme was development for the people of the North and to engage local people. But the creation through our chairmanship was also the Arctic Economic Forum, which is a business arm of the Arctic Council, to come up with the private sector, to basically engage the private sector in some of the Arctic challenges that we have. An example would be solar energy. So we can learn from Norway or Denmark in dealing with some of the challenges that we have in the North. So that forum was established to engage the private sector in some of the new technology that's being developed in other Arctic nations that can be adapted to others. So it was a perfect opportunity to address you know, not just the opportunities from the private sector engagement from country to country, but also to educate ourselves as Arctic nations, some of the technology that's being developed that, you know, oftentimes we have technology developed in the south that does not work in the north. So how do we bridge some of that form? So through the Arctic Council, that was the first for, I mean, Canada led the creation of the forum itself, and it to date has produced a lot of good information for governments to also engage in. But, you know, Canada, you know, Nunavut alone, you know, our neighbor to the east is Denmark, and to the north is Russia, and to the west it's the United States. So we're, you know, there's lessons to be learned in sharing information from Arctic to Arctic, because we are facing similar challenges, particularly around climate change and adaptation. At the same time, infrastructure development specifically for the north is really important. And through the Arctic Economic Forum, Arctic Council, that was the goal was to try and address the gap that we were dealing with around technology and information sharing Arctic to Arctic. And it is a perfect forum, in my view, to engage our Arctic nations in some of the challenges that we faced.
But currently suspended, and ironically, Russia is currently the chair as the rotating. David, moving to this issue of tension, and Leona has kind of painted a picture of the neighbors that we have in the Arctic, most notably Russia, which at its closest point, and this is sometimes forgotten, often forgotten. I mean, it's thousands of kilometers when one looks at the circumference of the Earth, but it's 82 kilometers at its closest point. Now that's a little island that exists, but generally speaking, it's around 300 kilometers at various points over water, over what used to be entirely frozen water, and it's sometimes described as high north, low tension doctrine. But that is sort of been blown away, so to speak, by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Ironically, there were a lot of Ukrainians working in the Russian Arctic and working in the mining sector. David, in addition to your military experience, you of course worked in the business world now. You work with Bank of Montreal. You've taught and spoken in the business world about the opportunities that are there. How do you see this current conflict impacting people's view of the Arctic, and how does that play into decisions making around the investment that we all know is necessary?
Oh, you're on mute.
Great question. And let me just unpack both sides of the question. For the last decade plus, Russia has been rebuilding their military presence all throughout the northern region of their country. We are actually lagging behind a threat that has been building quietly in the Arctic and in the north for decades. And it was designed not for altruistic purposes. And what's going on in Ukraine should remind us that we should be fearful and be prepared for that type of thing that's happening. So, you know, this is where I see the need for leadership and vision by Canada to build defensive posture up there. And going back to what Sean said, a persistent presence, both physically, cyber, up in the space, under the water, that we can actually defend our sovereignty. And this is something where we can engage the locals, and, you know, everyone should benefit from it. So in fact, I could see the Canadian technology benefit from it. I could see the locals benefit from it. And, you know, the military will have a footprint up there that they can use to defend our sovereignty. So there's an awful lot more we can do in that realm. Now, I'm going to put on my civilian hat here, and I've been a business leader now for coming on to 10 years, and I see a real threat to Canadian sovereignty by outside countries trying to come in to buy our resource bases. And most recently, we've had some certain countries trying to buy, mines and whatnot up in the north that actually had access to ports. And these are our resources. These are things that Canada needs to decide how do we want to use. These are things that we need to talk to the locals about, so we do it in a responsible manner that Canadians are known for, and not by another country that will just grab it, leave us with the environmental fallout from this. But we've got to take care of ourselves and not be used for a short-term gain on some sort of balance sheet, but a long-term loss strategically. So I think from an investment point of view, we need a bigger discussion with parliamentarians and business leaders about what we're going to do with the resources up there. For the first time in our history, are now available and accessible to be used in a responsible manner. So there's a defense agenda and there's an economic agenda that are coming together here. And this is where Canada needs a strategy, and not just a strategy. We need a plan that actually has metrics that can be measured, that will actually develop the wealth creation for this nation in a responsible way that defends our sovereignty.
And David, that includes obviously many of these important infrastructure. You mentioned ports. There's roads obviously that are yet to be constructed, airstrips. Is there a role? And I'm going to move to Sean on that question of infrastructure as well. But is there a role to have that greater coordination between the military and the private sector and the government, obviously overseeing this? And what about NORAD? Because people seem to get a little bit alarmed around discussions of NORAD and NATO in the Arctic, that Canada, is militarizing the Arctic. But I think you've made the case that we need to be there in more substantive ways. Sorry, that was to you, David, and then I'm going to move to Sean quickly. A role for NORAD and NATO.
Yeah, so the other thing I would say, NORAD in 1957 was about space, air, but in 2006, it actually included now maritime domain awareness. And when I was with the United States Northern Command, I was working on the development of maritime domain awareness. And, interesting, an infantry officers doing maritime domain awareness, but the Rustbaga Treaty of 1817 is alive and well. But it really highlighted for me the importance that NORAD is more encompassing. It's a defensive organization. It's about detecting, surveying, and providing people like you and Leona with information so that you can make informed decisions about what we need to do to protect ourselves. So, this is not about militarizing the North. This is about providing information so people can make informed decisions. And at the same time, we should be looking at the economic opportunities, which you just said. We need to bring all the parties together to have a conversation.
Sean, the senior service, you've spent time in the Arctic. You know how difficult it is at the, even at the best of time. And some forget that the opening of Arctic waters doesn't necessarily mean easier to navigate. There's a lot more moving ice up there. But just pick up on where David left off in terms of the military role, but also the coordination role between the various interests, which sometimes seem to be competing, but really could be complementary if properly coordinated.
Absolutely. I've done 3 tours, Otnanook. And it is a very difficult place to conduct operations, as well as I worked at the Maritime Security Operations Center, where we were shared responsibility for a portion of the surveillance in the Arctic. And I just want to bring something up here that we're getting called out internationally for not meeting our 2% GDP for defense and security. And I think that this is a real opportunity where we could significantly increase that our numbers and spend that money inside of our borders, hiring our own people, using our own technology technicians and engineering people, as well as employing many people in the Arctic to build infrastructure that has multi-use. And I'm not talking missiles and bombs and weapons. I'm talking about solid infrastructure that allows us to conduct a lot of environmental assessments and surveillance, a lot of maritime search and rescue, and as well, you know, there's got to be, now that things are opening up in the form of tourism, there's also a constabulary requirement that will need to be met. We'll need more presence of people to stop polluters and more presence to stop other things. So when we talk about securing the Arctic, we're actually talking about securing the Arctic. It's not just about, you know, the Russians are coming. By the way, the Russians are coming. So, you know, I think that it's something that we can be doing, spending the money inside of our borders and really moving things forward and understanding the Arctic. And by the way, the Russians have been putting a research station in the Arctic for at least a decade now, every single year, and they post people there and have a persistent surveillance capability above, on, and below the water and the ice. So we are so far behind, we need to move things forward.
Well, and that's without mentioning the obvious that they have nuclear sub capability and strike capability, not to sound too ominous, but you're right as far, and David, you referenced this, the Russians have been building up now for some time, recapitalizing existing or older bases, the changes in the physical environment to make it more accessible year round. Sean, talk a little bit about the ports, though. You've mentioned your tours through there, and with the Canadian Navy, we're building now Arctic offshore patrol vessels, which are going to be certainly an asset. We are recapitalizing the entire Navy, surface combatants, but ice-breaking capability, and we don't have, you know, currently in the fleet anything that can operate year-round, nor do we have aircraft carriers. We are, of course, you know, working closely with the United States of America, but in terms of even the existing infrastructure to service vessels and to be able to refuel, there are limited capabilities there as we speak.
Absolutely, and we've been talking about putting a naval station in the Arctic now for at least 20 years, and to this date we don't have it. You know, in Iqaluit, it's very difficult to get a Halifax class ship alongside. They've got to go to anchor, which makes its own challenges. We have the Arctic Offshore Patrol vessel, which is an outstanding start. It's a great start to securing the Arctic, but it's really not enough. It is still only a summer ice capable ship. And again, I don't want to degrade the ship because it is an excellent ship. It's built here in Canada, and it does a very good job for what it was designed to do, which was patrol the Arctic in summer ice. But that's really not enough. We need a presence, and I keep saying this, but I come back to it, but it's a persistent surveillance in the Arctic where we have above, on, and below the surface capability all year round, and that it is done by the people of Canada, because if we don't do it, someone will do it for us.
So Peter, if I could
yeah, please go ahead, David, jump in.
I just want to pick up on that persistent presence. You know, we have to look at Canada as a system of systems approach, where we look at space, we look at air, we look at sea, we look at land, we look at cyber. All those can be components of a persistent presence. And this is a game where we need some vision and some strategy and a plan how we're going to do this. Like what Sean said, we need it all. We need more Arctic patrol vessels. We need more Coast Guard, you know, ice capable Coast Guard vessels. We need more infrastructure up there. We need more engagement by the local population. And I would also say the engagement is also building educational facilities in the north, where we can actually start educating people and doing a knowledge sharing from what people up there already know to people like us down in the south, who will start to appreciate more A, culture, B, the environment, and everything else, because it's all about education. So I think, you know, we need a comprehensive strategy for what we're talking about here. That is, you know, like on that multiple choice question that I always got wrong was E, all of the above.
All of the above. Leona, you've been an advocate for all of the above for a very long time. I've seen you passionately defend the interests of the North, either at the cabinet table, at international gatherings. Talk a little bit about some of those things we need to check the box on, the investments, the infrastructure, the education, the inclusiveness of Arctic people. I mean, I think famously in the last number of years, it dawned on everyone when they found the Franklin expedition, if they had simply listened to the people of the North decades ago, they would have found them. They might even have rescued them. Who knows?
Right. Yeah, the discovery of Franklin ships that happened right outside my home community. And the Inuit have been saying for many, many years that the location of the vessels, and that went ignored. But I mean, it just illustrates the disconnect of the knowledge of the local people not being used to resolve some of these issues. And there's a wealth of information I think that we should be tapping into in the North. The other piece right now is around infrastructure. Like Canada's North is a coastal community, and many of the communities right now lack adequate offloading of vessels, ships, like annual sea lift. We made significant investments when we were in government to invest in a deep sea port in Iqaluit for the first time. It should be completed this summer, in Pangertung and Pond Inlet. But those are 3 communities of 25 that require, or 24 to Baker Lakes Inland, but just in terms of investing in the infrastructure to be able to operate in the North is critical. The other piece of infrastructure that is being led by an Inuit organization in the west of Nunavut is to develop a deep sea port and highway to the Northwest Territories. And that is being led by Inuit organizations, the Inuit organization in the West, and very little, every other place in Canada from west to east and up and down every province, the federal government had made contributions to investing in highways. But when it comes to the Arctic, that becomes an impossible task. So the leadership right now, just even connecting Nunavut for the first time to another jurisdiction, is being led by Inuit organizations that would open up opportunities, but also it would address some of the challenges that the government faces around patrolling and what have you in the North. And I think we tend to be reactionary to when issues happen, that we're paying attention to the North because of this Russia issue, when it should be the Arctic is an integral part of our sovereignty, our security, and it should not be an afterthought. And as it is right now, there's very little leadership. The current government does not have even an Arctic strategy for the North, a plan. Like under the Harper government, we had a Northern strategy that addressed sovereignty, it addressed economic development, it addressed investing in the people through education, what have you. And right now, there is zero leadership around the Arctic security issue. And this should not be a one-time thing. It should be a constant initiative to deal with our surveillance in the North, and tapping into the resources of the people that are there, that you can partner with and be innovative in some of the things that we have to address around security issues. And really, at this point in time, there is very little federal leadership around securing the Arctic.
And Leona, we both know, having spent some time in that, they sometimes call it Disney by the Rideau in Ottawa, where getting decisions even on the table, let alone acted upon, it is challenging. But it does require that persistence and the championing of the Arctic, which doesn't, and I don't want this to be partisan. We obviously have our biases, all of us, but it doesn't seem that, short of the crisis in Ukraine, which has led to further discussions about the Arctic, this simply has not been a priority for some time. It's been done in fits and starts. And of course, even in the south of 60, to get a big infrastructure project through is a challenge. to build a pipeline, at the risk of opening a controversial subject. And by the way, there has been talk in the past of a pipeline to Churchill and utilizing that opening of Arctic waters to move Canadian liquefied natural gas to world markets. Just very quickly, your thoughts, and then I'd like to hear from David and Sean as well about the opportunity to move goods, because transportation in the Arctic, as challenging as it is, really seems to be the next frontier. And that's where, of course, it opens up this vulnerability, but also the opportunity for Canada to be a world leader in the movement of some of our most critical resources, whether it be energy or food.
Mm-hmm. Is that directed to me, Peter?
Yes, please, Leona.
Okay. So in terms of the cost of living in the north it's very expensive to transport any goods to the north. And every single product that is in the north comes from the south. So when it came to investing in infrastructure, as an example, I've always said, it might be a project in Nunavut, but all the resources to construct, say, housing comes from the south. So it's an investment in where you purchase your supplies. One of the other things around the transportation, like the north, after this sea lift, is going to be hit real hard with the cost of increased goods in the south. And as it is now, you pay about $12 for 2 liters of milk. So that'll increase, and there's going to be a shock reaction to the pricing after this summer sea lift in the Arctic. And so one of the challenges of operating in the north is not just the environment itself, but also the cost to be able to purchase items in the north is really quite expensive. And what is the solution to that? So one of the things I've always fought against was introducing the carbon tax, because that again increases the cost of shipping. In that, I think that the Arctic should have been excluded from that tax itself, because the cost of goods up north is already 4 times more expensive than southern Canada. So what's challenging in the north for people is managing the cost, but to add a tax onto the shipping of every single piece of good that is in the north it's fairly it's quite unfair, because in the south you have choices. You have highways, you have choices of stores. In the north we don't have those options. So so part of just operating in the north is challenging, but to punish a small population with an increased cost of transporting every item to the north is, in my view, it's really grossly unfair.
Unfair and punitive. That's right. We speak of, one unified country and shared services. Very, very difficult for the government of Nunavut and the Northwest Territories and Yukon to meet those challenges. David, not to personalize this, but I spent 2 summers as a student working on those supply ships and those seasonal voyages that Leona referenced that bring all of the necessities of life to the Arctic. And you can only get into some of those ports. I've been to Pond Inlet and Pangerton and Iqaluit, but you can only get in by sea, as Sean will know, at certain times of the year. We now have Globemaster aircraft, among the biggest in the world. We have had Hercs for years. Can the Canadian Forces play more of an active role in bringing some of those essential things? $12 for a liter of milk, fresh fruit. Malnutrition is a real issue among the Indigenous population of the North. But without the critical infrastructure and more, I know you're an Army guy, Sean's from the Navy, we maybe need an Air Force perspective, but you've commanded the critical supplies that went into Afghanistan. Surely if we can bring things to Afghanistan, we can get things to the high north in Canada.
Well, absolutely, Peter. But and I would kind of spin it back onto the economic discussion that there are private sector companies that can do this much better than the military can. And I go back to Afghanistan. What did I look out in the Afghan airfield? DHL planes and all sorts of cargo planes landing in a combat zone. You couldn't get a Canadian plane landing in a combat zone, but you could get commercial bringing in all the materials that you're talking about into an area where we needed it. So I go back to, where is the leadership of this country that will start building ports, ice breaking capabilities to keep the ports open as long as possible, bigger ships to bring in more materials, warehouse it, and then have roads, and then have airheads. You know, we built a railway across this nation. We built a series of Trans-Canada highways across this nation. That took leadership. That took a lot of risk taking. We need the same type of leadership to do the same thing for the North. If we did it then, why can't we do it now? And this goes back to what you said at the very beginning. Let's bring all the parties together and let's figure out how to do it. And not, the problems are there, but don't tell me the problems. Tell me what the solutions are going to be. And I think we just have to go back to our history to say, how did we do it before? Let's do it again.
What a nation building exercise that would be. And, while Canadians, and I speak sentimentally in this, but it's a reality, a lot of Canadians feel an enormous affection and attachment. And you probably hear this a lot, Leona, and yet they've never been there and probably never will. But they do feel that it is an important and investment worthy part of our country. Sean, talk a little bit about that case that has to be made to the rest of the country in terms of not just the security sovereignty part, but bringing the sense of belonging into Canada. And I'm really interested in your thoughts on that as well, Leona. So Sean, first to you.
Well, Peter, as a simple boy from Newfoundland, I got to tell you, somebody who's been to the Arctic 3 times now, I would strongly suggest to all Canadians to go there, because it is absolutely beautiful. The people are wonderful, and it is a gem to be discovered. I look very fondly of each time that I've been to the Arctic. So, really, if this were an issue where we had a severe threat to our sovereignty in Newfoundland or Vancouver or British Columbia, we wouldn't even be having this conversation, because the plan would be open and we'd be pushing on that plan right now. And I think that there is whether it be a racial or economic bias over the dozens of years that we have been talking about securing the Arctic. I'm not quite sure, but I really think that it's time that we as Canadians embrace each other and we start solving these problems. As General Fraser said, what a great national exercise this would be to bring everybody together, to start putting resources in the Arctic and move this along. And really, to be frank, stop talking about it. Start doing it.
Yeah. That action-driven approach does appear to be lacking, and it's encapsulated in the word leadership. Leona, talk about that great human resource of the Arctic, the 113,000 Canadians who are there and who are Canadian, but sometimes feel maybe we're not as Canadian as other Canadians. To not oversimplify it. I recall going to a community event of which you were a part. Prime Minister Harper was there, General Natinchuk was there, and I've never felt more Canadian being in that gymnasium and being exposed to things that I'd never seen or tasted before. It's the first time I've eaten Norwell, and I was just really amazed at how excited people were to be part of that community celebration. And it was so unique and so much a part of what I'd read about, but never really experienced.
Northerners and Inuit are proud Canadians. And it's a culture where sharing is an integral part of our communities. And so for anyone who's not been in the North, I would recommend going in the North. Canada is an Arctic country, and it's a beautiful part of the world that we live in up north. But the most important resource and asset are the people. And investing in the people through education or university, what have you, I think, it's a young territory created in 1999. We still have our challenges in Nunavut, but it's not lost on people in terms of going forward and building those opportunities for the local Inuit. And I look at even off Baffin Island, the fishing industry, that's an emerging market for our communities, and that's an investment to employ local people. But what was really telling during our time in government and making the investments related to infrastructure was, I just found it appalling in that the fishing industry had to travel to Greenland to offload because Iqaluit did not have, the capital at Nunavut, did not have a deep sea port. And it's mind-boggling that a capital city would not have a deep sea port and whatnot, but we invested that as a government. And that'll be completed this summer. So, and it's just telling in that we're so behind in investing in those infrastructures that you see in the South. Canadians have choices to drive to BC or fly or whatnot, but in the Arctic, it's an integral part of our community. It's a necessity, and those are the areas where I think we are making some strides. But the last 6-7 years, we have not seen major infrastructure investments made to address even the port issues. During our time, we built the Inuvik-Tuk Highway and completed that project, and that's a strategic location again for search and rescue or Coast Guard, what have you, in the Arctic coastal community. And similar investments around infrastructure need to continue to be made throughout the North, and the Northerners have advocated and worked to address some of those. And when I mentioned Qetelmuyt Inuit Association is taking the lead in building a highway, and any highway it's a government responsibility, but the leadership is coming from the local people to try and address some of the challenges they face in transporting goods. If we build a highway, it would reduce the cost of goods that are being shipped to that particular region. So again, the information and the investments and the ideas, they're coming through the Inuit organizations. And right now, the Inuit organizations are very supportive of resource development, as an example, because it creates opportunities for Inuit employment and businesses to develop that support the industry, but in a very responsible way. In the Arctic, we don't have the same opportunities that you see in the South. We have, it's an Arctic, it's an ice covered in ice most of the years, and so it's a different environment, different solutions. But it's really important, I think, again, to engage with the local people and build on that knowledge. And as a government, we also had made an investments in creating the Canada's High Arctic Research Station, located in Cambridge Bay, and again, a strategic look to be able to build information knowledge about the Arctic in the Arctic. And before, we didn't have a place to even do our adequate research, whether that be around climate change or wildlife or what have you. We had no venue, but our government had made that investments in Cambridge Bay. Now we have the capabilities of state-of-the-art facility to conduct the research in the Arctic. And in my view, the information collected from the local people in any research that you do, whether that be around climate, is critical. The traditional knowledge of people that have worked and survived in the harshest environment in the world is information that, in my view, should be tapped into more often. And I mean, the Franklin example, the Sir John Franklin lost ship, is an example of using local knowledge to solve a mystery. So, but investing in people, the most important resource is that. But at the same time, Canadians can learn a lot from the local knowledge that's there, whether you're studying the climate and what's changing in the North. And Inuit knowledge is like, we have, let's say, 11 words to describe snow, right? And those are from local hunters, and the patterns of snow is to give you directions here or there. I mean, there's such wealth of information that we should be tapping into to come up with some of the challenges that we face and or opportunities.
Leona, that's why I love talking to you. I always learn something new every time. There are 11 words for snow. Um, I, David, I want to give you an opportunity just for those on the line to understand the capability that the Arctic Rangers bring to our country and the unique role that they play, both militarily, but I think culturally and maybe bridging some of this divide in terms of people's perception of what we currently have in the Arctic. And then if you would just touch again on some of these gaps, these capability gaps, strategic gaps that do exist, and what would be needed, you know, as far as investment. We've touched on this a little bit already, but just some clarity and your perspective, having worked a lot with the Americans, you know, because the Americans clearly are the country that we have the shared responsibility for North America and coastal approach and all of what comprises NORAD, but you have a unique perspective on that as well.
Well, Peter, the Rangers are one of Canada's jewels. That they're celebrating their 75th anniversary, I think, this year. They are across not just the north, but a lot of northern communities in Canada. There are patrols across this nation. They are absolutely great Canadians doing great service because they simplistically are our eyes and ears. Well, as Sean has mentioned before, we don't have this persistent presence up there, but they're doing an awful lot of good. So they provide us early warning. The second thing is they are great ambassadors for the Indigenous peoples of the North by educating and training people like me. So when I go and talk to them and whatnot, I have yet to talk to anybody who's ever come back and worked with the Rangers that hasn't gone, wow, aren't they amazing people? And they're Canadians, and we didn't know anything about them.
David, you probably met him. The top shot in the Canadian Forces was from Nunavut, and he was a polar bear hunter. And Leona, I know you have family members that are involved in that important trade, but I was just amazed. And he was using an old Lee Enfield rifle and was a left hand that had to reach across the breech. So yeah, incredible capabilities. Sorry to interrupt you, David.
No, listen, we could go on all day for stories. I mean, there's just great people, and I go back to, and not just those, but I would go back to the Indigenous people in the South, and I've been, and I did the Bold Eagle program and whatnot. You don't know what you don't know, as Rumsfeld said, and we don't know enough about our Indigenous communities here. They're Canadians, but we got to do an awful lot more to learn and understand them. But going back to the capability deficiencies we have capabilities, but they're kind of the 50s, 60s, and maybe the 80s technology. We've now got to up it. Like as soon as you buy a TV set, it's already out of date. Well, we all buy TV sets, and now's the time to buy the new TV set, and it's called a radar system. Looking over the horizon into Russia, where the threat is, and a lot of those companies reside here in Canada. So we need to buy the latest technology and keep buying the technology that meets the ever-growing and changing nature. That's space. We're experts in space. We've got command systems that we need. We've got radar systems and sensor systems that we need to buy, and it's investing in the future. And so it's not a lost cause. Those are capabilities we need. We need more icebreakers, and a lot of them that will also help out what Leona was talking about. We need to have a concentrated effort on the North that will actually garner the attention of United States of America so they can put their emphasis on Europe and on the Pacific. And this is where Canada can really step up, spend the money that is investing in wealth creation. It can be contributing to the 2% of GDP for NATO spending, but also show the United States that we are serious about being good partners, good neighbors, which should actually make some of the conversations about trade and other things like Keystone a little bit easier. Because, we're going to be taken seriously and credibly, but we're holding up our end. So the North I see the North as an opportunity, as a catalyst to open up a lot of other doors And it's not, we've got to get beyond politics and get beyond that it's only 113,000 people. It's 40% of our landmass of Canadians that has a worldwide strategic significance. And when we talk about coast to coast to coast, we really, right now, we only have coast to coast with our railways and our highways. We've got to add the third part of the triangle, and that's the third coast. So
Absolutely.
simplistically, we've got to get and show some vision here of finishing off building this nation, which is the North.
Sean, we had an announcement from Defense Minister Anand just a week ago with respect to some of those investments. It's a big number, $30 billion proposed to be spent over 20 years. You know, my own bias, I suppose, having been in that department, is one of the big problems is you get an annual budget commitment and you have a hard time spending it, believe it or not. Very hard to get to, you can't buy things off the shelf when it comes to certain equipment. If it's, I mean, procurement is, you know, we could spend the entire time in this conversation speaking about what bedevils governments on procurement. But those investments, which the Americans, I agree with General Fraser, the Americans are getting very skeptical, and even the U.S. ambassador to Canada, Ambassador Cohen, came out quite sort of not negatively, but very, very skeptical about Canada's commitment based on recent, you know, examination of 1.4% of GDP being spent with respect to our NATO commitment. And I personally think, you know, us upping our game in the Arctic does, you know, contribute to NATO and NORAD spending in ways that benefit Canadians. And there's nothing wrong with that because we've been paying in to the NATO system for many, many years based on the belief that nothing would come to our shores, that we were somehow going to live in splendid isolation. You've been to the Arctic, you've referenced your time there. The maritime fragility, if you will, the species of fish that are there, the very rare environment in which you have to operate. And this is the technical side that I think you have a unique view of. What are your thoughts on some of the systems that David has described that need to be in place, where those investments can best be made, and what are the opportunities for Canadian companies, of which you represent one?
That's an awesome lead in there, Peter, because, you know, Canadian defense market right now, or the Canadian defense industry, has a huge amount to offer to the Arctic. And it's all innovations inside of Canada. And while the $30 billion sounds excellent, and I'm quite happy that there's an increase with $30 billion, the Canadian procurement system is struggling. It's struggling in a very bad way at this point in time. And while many countries are becoming very isolationist and protecting the technologies and the companies inside their borders, Canada is not necessarily leading the way in that function. So while that expenditure is out there, it may not necessarily be a Canadian company that gets that contract. Because the biggest contracts at most have 20% value proposition. So 20% has to be inside of Canada. In my opinion, it should be more along the lines of 80% should be inside of Canada. And we have like MDA, world leader in space. We have General Dynamics Land Systems, world leader in land systems and surveillance and protecting the land. We have my company, Geospectrum Technologies, one of the world leaders in surveillance of the oceans. And we have some amazing technologies that are currently being procured, and the investment is coming from Asia to our company. It's coming from Europe. It's coming from the United States. And Canada has got a new program on the go to hopefully help as well. But there is a significant contribution that can be given from the defense market here in Canada, and it can be multi-use. And again, like I said, it doesn't have to be effectors, it doesn't have to be bullets and bombs and guns. It is, you know, General Dynamics Land Systems has some amazing capability with radar systems, with multi-terrain vehicles. And those multi-terrain vehicles can be used for things that are not just effectors. They can be used for search and rescue. They can be used to help the rangers. Geospectrum's Technologies has the first containerized sonar system that has navigated through the Northwest Passage on one of the AOP ships. And we're ready to build more to be able to surveil what is in our waters, both environmentally and potentially in a defense posture. We have a plan that we developed for the Canadian government under IDEAS to do persistent acoustic surveillance. Unfortunately, it didn't get picked up because of lack of funding. So, and that plan was not a significant expenditure.
General Fraser, can you jump in on this too? And I also want your thoughts, Leona, on the opportunities for Arctic companies, specifically perhaps earmarking some of what we used to call industrial regional benefits for the Arctic. But General Fraser, you've experienced that frustration and seen it now from both inside and outside. I mean, the most recent decision to buy F-35 planes, of which I have a bias, I declare. But now the training and in-service support may go to another country, to Sean's point. The ability to resource some of these important investments, we still struggle, it seems, as a country to create the jobs and generate the economic wealth that could come from these massive, and we're talking billions of dollars being invested, and yet some of that work being done outside the country. You know, the Irving Shipyard is doing great work. We have IMP Aerospace here in Atlantic Canada, and I realize we all have a foot on the ground to one degree or another here in Atlantic Canada, and would love to see this region as well be major players in some and providing some of the important tools that the military will need. And in fact, you know, and both of you are a great example, Sean and David, of Canadians who have served in the country and then could be afforded opportunities on the industrial side and bring all that know-how and training and knowledge to bear to get the best equipment for Canada. You know, so that component sometimes is overlooked, and I find the government doesn't often champion the Canadian companies and industries in Canada in ways that they should more forcefully.
Yeah, Peter, I couldn't agree with you more, because in-service support represents approximately 60% of the total cost of any project. So when you buy the F-35, it's an expensive piece of kit, but you're going to spend, you know, 60% more than the sticker price of the plane on the life cycle cost of that whole plane. So if I look at all the infrastructure requirements that we are talking about for the North, yes, I see Northern companies bidding for that, but then the in-service support for the life of those infrastructure projects over the next 50, 100 years is an economic opportunity. And then I'm also encouraged when I see some Indigenous companies talking about some of the pipeline opportunities in BC and from Alberta. If they didn't have the capability, they said, hey, we'll build the company. Okay, we'll build the capability. We'll do it at home. We'll employ our own people here. And I think what we need to do is incentivize Canadians to be more entrepreneurial, that if it doesn't exist here, are you willing to take a little bit of risk to build it here and, you know, help out those companies start, you know, think big, start small, scale fast. And this is a game where Americans do it all the time. Yeah. You know, and this is where we've got to start saying, well, we don't have it here, we'll go down to the United States and get it. I'm not saying anything wrong with the United States.
We have seen it in the private sector. You're right. It's happened, for example, with the fishery on many occasions. That's evolved quickly. And Sean, up in your neck of the woods, you know, at Churchill Falls, we're seeing a lot more Indigenous contracts and capability come to bear. But the military hasn't really kept pace in terms of opening up those opportunities for.
The last thing, Sean, just want to say, the last thing about the military is that the military is good at doing what it does. The military is not good at building the new equipment. They should have the statement of requirement, and it be a requirement, and let the private sector fulfill that requirement. Sean, you're in a better position today to actually build the widget that that our Navy needs than you were when you were in the Navy. You could give the problem to the private sector, let them build it, but don't let the military engineers try to build something they don't have the skill sets to do. The private sector is better at doing this than the military. We employ, we don't build.
But as well, and I want to touch back on the Aboriginal content or Indigenous content, because we need, and Canada is starting to come around to say that there must be some sort of value proposition with respect to a percentage. However, it has to be well defined. And what I mean by that is you can't just do enough to get your points to win the contract and throw a few dollars down the line to the Indigenous offset. It has to be real money, and it has to be based on real substance to the program, not just look what we're doing so that it becomes a token amount. It needs to be exactly that. It needs to be an actual value proposition where we are working together with our Indigenous communities.
Leona, can you jump in and speak to that a little bit? And I also wanted to bring back this subject of the research cooperation that informs these important decisions of what's needed and procurement, but really, Sean's point, getting high level participation and giving the necessary resources and enablers to Indigenous people to play meaningful roles.
Mm-hmm. I think the approach to responding to that, I think the examples of the resource sector in the North, I think is a model that works very well for Indigenous people, Inuit people. Under the Nunavut Agreement, Land Claims Agreement, there's a provision in an article in that agreement that defines when projects may proceed. If you're looking at a mining sector, you can go through the environmental assessment process, but until you have an Inuit Impact Benefits Agreement in place, those permittings cannot be issued. So it's protected to an agreement form. But the examples of the resource sector tapping into building the capacity they need at the community level to provide support has been a very good model in that they're training local people and supporting the establishment of businesses that would provide services to the industry, but at the same time they're building the capacity. And I use Baker Lake as an example. Baker Lake had one of the highest, about 60–80% unemployment rate before the resource sector started a mine in that community. The company went out of their way to build the capacity at the community level, training and establishing businesses that provide the services to the industry, resulting in the unemployment rate going down to about 11% in that community. So the capacity building efforts that they had undertaken with very little government involvement, I may add, has that model itself in terms of what could work, and that could be duplicated in other regions. But the government's ability to their inability to trigger some of that is evident. I think the private sector does a very good job of understanding the business and starting businesses to support the sector. That's a model I think that we could learn from as well, in terms of how they were able to partner with Inuit organizations, as an example, in building the capacity that they need. And it's a real win-win situation. It reduces transporting employees from the south to the community or to the mine itself if you're building the capacity at the local level. I think those are models that we can learn from, and the willingness is there. It's just what are the opportunities to trigger that? And I think in Canada we lack the skills, I think, the expertise in some of these things, and when we should, in my view, be leaders in building those type of capacities that we need within our own country. So, and again, it
builds those bridges that you talked about earlier, and linkages and understanding, but you still do need those physical bridges to match the opportunities, as you said, with the people. And I recall David mentioned earlier in this broadcast about Canada on occasion opening up the resource sector in particular and allowing other countries to come in and perhaps reap benefits that should be reserved for Canadians, which leads me to a little bit of a discussion around China and their designs on the Arctic and their ambitions. They're building icebreakers, they're building aircraft carriers. There's no ice in Beijing Harbor. We know that they covet the transportation through internal Canadian waters. And we know that in mining and precious metals in particular, and energy, they have a tremendous appetite. And so this needs to be guarded in ways that require mature, informed, clear-eyed decision making. And including, and we saw this a little bit in Afghanistan and in other parts of the world. It's hard to imagine, and I'm not comparing the two or putting too fine a point on this, but the exploitation of resources is something that we need to be very wary of. And Leona, maybe just talk a little bit about that in terms of the unique and special needs of the North.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I'll use a real example where a mining company just south of Cambridge Bay, TMAC at the time, there was a proposal put forward from a Chinese company to purchase the gold mine south of Cambridge Bay, and that had to go through the whole Canada Investment Act. At the same time, the analysis was also conducted because the distance early warning system is quite adjacent to that sector, and to have a foreign company come in and purchase a gold mine south of Cambridge Bay and be that close to the distance early warning system, so it raised the whole question about the security issue in the North. So I think we need to pay attention to foreign companies coming into the North in different areas. I mean, we have MMG, which is again south of Cambridge Bay, and it's a foreign company that owns the resources there. So we have to be very I think be very cautious of some of these investments may be strategic for other reasons, and I think we cannot be ignorant to that at all in understanding what's there. And in the Arctic, since 1999, we now have 3 operating mines in the North, and so the development is not going to go away anytime soon. I mean, there are benefits to resource development in the North for Northern people, but at the same time, I think we have to be very careful in terms of who owns those companies, and on a going forward basis, and the locations of the resources is also, distance early warning issue. Like that's another security issue that we have to be very mindful of in dealing with the acquisition of a company, a gold mine company in Nunavut.
David, we know that climate change is creating volatility. We know that the geopolitics has kind of knocked the old world order off its axis, and geopolitics is ever changing. You've walked through the halls of NORAD and NATO, and you've met with a lot of leaders in the area of both business and military. Talk a little bit about that, the need for Canada to, not be naive about the vulnerabilities and the intentions of some of our adversaries when it comes to the protection of our resources and the protections in particular that pertain to the North.
Yeah. Ukraine and Russia has been a bit of a wake-up call, because we've gone perhaps the longest period in our living memory of peace in our times, but there have always been threats out there, be it terrorist threats, the Russian threat, and an emerging economic threat called China. And we shouldn't be naive that what we take for granted becomes free. And I go back to what Leona said earlier, and you about investment and our resources. I look at all the companies that just pulled out of Russia, not because of government. Government sanctions is one thing, but companies like McDonald's, Renault, have pulled out of Russia because their 20 years of investment actually boomeranged back on them in a negative way. So I think, from an economic point of view, going back to your point about China, we have to have a serious conversation about, do we as companies in the private sector, as the West, want to be that close to a regime that doesn't share our values? And we have become so economically tied to China that, Russia only has an economy about the size of Texas, so we can get through this one. And look at what machinations it's doing to the world economy. China takes it to a new quantum. So we have to look at, the politics is, we may be working with them today, but do they really share our values? And we have to be wary and not just be lulled into a false sense of security and peace that just doesn't exist. And, I don't want to be a warmonger. I'm the last person who wants to go to war, but I do want to protect our resources. I want to protect our sovereignty, our liberties. And that means that when companies come into Canada and want to buy our resources, do Canadians benefit from the wealth creation? Do we benefit from that? And do those products actually get put to good use, or are they actually be going back to foster something that doesn't meet our values? And so it's a very complex question you asked. And I look at it from a really holistic point of view as what I would call a hybrid leader, not just a private sector or a former soldier.
David, that leads to a question for you, Sean, on one of those vulnerabilities, and it's certainly not confined just to the North, but that is around cyber. And David, I think you referenced this earlier as well. This is in your wheelhouse, Sean, where we're now perhaps even more vulnerable because of our over-reliance on technology, our reliance particularly on communications, and the security around communication itself has been discussed, and what happened to NORAD as a Canadian company that was in steep decline just as Huawei was emerging. A lot of cyber attacks clearly emanating from not just China, but Iran, Russia, other, let's call them adversaries. Talk for a moment about how that applies to the Arctic and just the regular challenges that you have communicating in the Arctic for both domestic and military purpose.
Well, first off, communications in the Arctic is difficult. And it is something that is being worked on right now with minor infrastructure spending. Could be much better. Satellite communications is very, very difficult. Putting a satellite in the Arctic becomes only able to work in the Arctic, so it's not incredibly cost effective based on the lack of number of people and the users. So you have to look at some sort of landline and or RF technology. Other than that, now that the waterways are getting a little more friendly for infrastructure, there can be high-speed undersea cables, and there are a lot of Canadian companies that are leading in that capability. But then on top of just being able to communicate, now you have to be able to secure those communications. And if you're securing those communications with RF technology, that becomes very, very challenging. When you're using undersea cables, it's a little bit better. They're a little bit easier to secure because they're fiber optic. You would have to send a submarine down and tap them, which is possible, but it's a little more difficult for any sort of threat country. And satellite is a little more secure, but again, we have those challenges with that. And to show that it is such a concerning thing, the government of Canada and the United States government have set minimum regulations for companies such as ours who are dealing with the government. It's called CMMC, where we have to go through an audit similar to the ISSO audits to show that we are doing things to keep our own systems as secure as we can, so that somebody doesn't shut down Canadian infrastructure such as ours, or any other for that matter. But there's a significant amount of money being spent on securing our cyber capability, both in industry and in Canada. And it's very interesting that, we discuss selling a mine or selling a piece of Canada to a country that is trying to infiltrate our infrastructure on a nearly daily or even hourly basis. And if we get back to the mine systems, China owns 70% of rare earth metals right now. And for those who aren't familiar, rare earth metals are the key product in electric vehicles.
Right.
So if they own 70% of the rare earth metals that are being produced at this moment, imagine if they managed to get all of the rest, because there's apparently some opportunities for rare earth metals to be in the Arctic.
Yes.
So if Canada or if China were able to get a complete market hold on rare earth metals, imagine flipping this around and saying one country had 80 or 70% or 100% of all the fuel in the world today. What kind of control over the world would they have? And
how
we are
chilling
on
that is when we
yes,
think
we're
about what
on our
happened
way to
during the
that.
pandemic with ventilators and PPE. Sean, I got a very particular question, and I'm conscious of the time, and I've been hogging the
Okay.
podium as far as the questions. But a question with respect to the over-horizon radar, which was perfected at Memorial University in St. John's, that tracks icebergs for offshore oil exploration and safety, and I suspect there's a weather component to that too, installed by Northern Radar in Sri Lankan for their defense purposes, yet it was canceled, a program that was canceled in Canada some years ago. And the Canadian Navy did a pilot test of this at Harlan Point in Nova Scotia. But why do you think Canada didn't buy into this great Canadian technology that could be used in the Arctic? We talked a little bit about this.
So I was actually part of that trial actually for
Oh,
high
were you?
frequency surface wave radar, HFSWR. Yeah, and it's a really good piece of kit that has extreme potential. And the problem, I think, that why Canada didn't go with it, it's not because of the actual piece of equipment itself, is more along the lines of the plan of, okay, what else are we going to do to support this? Knowing that there's a blip on a radar system 300 miles away is a piece of information. It's a key piece of information, but it's only a piece of the puzzle. And I think that Canada didn't have a maritime domain awareness plan of how that piece of the puzzle fit in the larger scheme of things. So it really just kind of went off to the wayside, which is horrible. And it happens with so many innovative items that are here in Canada right now. And I think HFSWR is definitely has merit in the maritime domain all around Canada, potentially. Just like many other innovative items that we have. I was a big advocate of HFSWR. When I was doing the trial, it was very, very new, and it had a little bit of ways to go. But apparently, it's met all of the challenges that it had.
We've got too many examples of that, including the Avro Arrow.
Yep.
Leona, I want to come to, I guess, a political question with respect to the opportunities for interprovincial, interterritorial cooperation. And, you know, we hear those words spoken often, but there aren't significant examples of where Quebec, for example, or Newfoundland and Labrador, or any of the provinces have really reached out or tried to bring about or foster greater cooperation at that governmental level. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because you've served in different levels of government.
I think there's a missed opportunity there as well. You know, like I look at my home region, where the Inuit organizations in the West partnering with Northwest Territories business community to develop the highway as an example, and the spin-offs associated with that. Given I think the size of Nunavut is 2 million square kilometers as an example. It's a huge region, and you know, it's the only region or only province territory in Canada that covers 3 time zones. And so there's challenges of operating in that. But I think in terms of business opportunities or government to government relations, and I look at even just the East Coast, you know, there were attempts in the past to have direct flights from Halifax to Nunavut, given that we have a very high population of individuals in the Atlantic regions in the north, and the traffic was quite high. So they tried stuff like that. I think from the business side of things, the business community does a better job than in partnering with other businesses. And I look at the fishing industry and the direct link from the Baffin region to Newfoundland, Labrador. So there's opportunities that way. In terms of the leadership related to government, right now, there really is no federal leadership related to development of the North. And I think that's something that there's a huge opportunity there. But at the same time, as I think David had mentioned, that there has to be a plan that develops the North and what those innovative approaches will be. Like, it has to be done, I think, in partnership with the local people as well as the different levels of government. And other jurisdictions may be, appropriate to be a partner in some of that. And I look at Greenland. Greenland has put a lot of, and it's an hour flight from Iqaluit, and they put in a lot of energy and resources to developing hydro, as an example, in the Arctic environment, similar conditions. And there's partnerships to be learned from different, Denmark or Greenland's approach to that. And the territorial governments and business communities have done trips to Greenland to learn from different countries in terms of how they're dealing with infrastructure development, high cost of energy, and so forth. But there is again, I think, a missed opportunity, and lack of leadership related to reaching out in terms of what those partnerships would look like is quite lacking at this point. But once you have a plan in place for the Arctic in terms of how you're going to develop it, then you can run with that. You can run with that and build those bridges and connections. But in the absence of that, there is very little vision and leadership related to the development of the North as it stands right now. So, and I think, again, it will take leadership and vision to do that.
It seems that leadership, vision, a plan, and a desire to implement appears to be a common theme throughout this discussion for the last 90 minutes. And I really want to take the opportunity to thank all of you for giving really, insightful and thoughtful comments on this discussion around how we do more to engage and to cooperate in the Arctic. Whether it's the permanently personed station at Alert, the infrastructure investment, the cooperation across the private sector and government and across various levels of government. But all of you are leaders and have acted in significant ways throughout your careers to benefit the people of the North and to benefit Canadians. And very grateful for that, and equally grateful to know you and appreciate so much of what you do and to have spent some time with you here this afternoon. So wish you the very best. I hope to see you personally over the summer. Leona, there's a good chance it'll be in a hockey rink or a ball field. David, I hope you get back to Truro and visit your roots and your family here. And Sean, I'm going to be in Newfoundland later in this summer for an aerospace and defense conference in St. John's, and maybe we'll cross paths there. But again, really wonderful conversation. Wishing you and yours the very best, and hope to see you soon. Bye for now.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.